What happens when the country people run to for safety is accused of handing their names back to the government they escaped? Because if even part of this new lawsuit is true, the story is not just political. It is personal, dangerous, and potentially life-changing for people who thought America was the safer side of the door. Before we go deeper, do me one favor, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with one person who still believes asylum stories are just paperwork, because what you are about to hear is anything but paperwork. A new federal lawsuit filed in Washington is making a claim so serious that even reading it feels heavy. The Iranian American Legal Defense Fund says the U.S. government, under the Trump administration, shared confidential immigration information about Iranian asylum seekers with the Iranian government. Not rumors from social media, not a leaked text message from one random employee, a court filing, a formal accusation, a legal case that now puts the entire asylum system under a harsh light. And right away, we need to be careful and honest. These are allegations. They have not been proven in court. The government has already pushed back. The Department of Homeland Security said the accusation that ISIS shared asylum application records with Iran is false. That matters. Due process matters. Facts matter. But here is why this story still hits so hard, even at the allegation stage. The entire asylum system runs on trust. People tell the U.S. government the most dangerous truth of their lives because they believe that truth will be protected. If that trust is broken, the damage is not just legal, it is human. Think about the kind of person who applies for asylum from Iran. According to the lawsuit and the reporting around it, many are people who say they were targeted because of their religion, their sexuality, their politics, or their activism. Some are people linked to the women, life, freedom protests. Some are converts to Christianity. Some are members of the LGBTQ community. Some are dissidents who believe that if they return to Iran, prison, torture, or death is not a dramatic possibility. It is a realistic one. Now pause there for a second. Imagine what it takes for a person to tell a foreign government that story, to hand over names, dates, family details, locations, travel history, and the reasons you fear going home. That is not a form you fill out casually. That is a confession of fear. It is a map of vulnerability. And asylum confidentiality rules exist for a reason. They were built precisely because governments people flee from can retaliate if they learn who tried to escape, who asked for protection, and why. That is why this lawsuit is so explosive. It claims that starting in March 2025, U.S. officials arranged regular contacts with Iranian officials and shared sensitive immigration records involving Iranian detainees. The reporting says those records allegedly included final orders of removal, applications for relief, and even asylum applications. The lawsuit also says Iranian officials later met with detainees inside ICE facilities, and some detainees believed those officials already knew intimate details from their cases. If that happened, then the fear was not abstract anymore. It walked into the room. And that is the detail I do not want you to miss. This story is not only about files moving from one desk to another, it is about what those files represent. A government file is never just paper when it contains a person's deepest fear, the names of relatives back home, and the exact reason a repressive state might want revenge. In cases like this, a file can become pressure. A file can become leverage. A file can become a threat sent across borders without a single soldier moving. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in Washington, D.C., and Public Citizen is helping represent the group that brought the case. They are asking the court to stop any further sharing, force notice to affected asylum seekers, and put independent oversight in place. In plain English, they are saying this situation is too dangerous to leave inside the same system now accused of causing it. That alone tells you how serious they believe this is. But to really understand why this case matters, you have to zoom out. Because this is bigger than one filing, one administration, or one news cycle. The central question is simple, and it is chilling. What happens when the system designed to protect vulnerable people is accused of exposing them instead? For decades, asylum has carried a basic promise. Tell us why you are afraid. Tell us who hurt you. Tell us what could happen if you are sent back. And in return, the government is supposed to handle that information with extreme care. The late 1990s, regulations around asylum confidentiality were not decorative. They were not optional. They were built around a brutal reality. When oppressive governments learn that someone applied for asylum abroad, they may not just punish that person. They may punish parents, siblings, partners, neighbors, friends, or anyone tied to the person who left. That matters a lot in the Iranian context. Iran has long been accused by human rights groups of targeting dissidents, religious minorities, women who challenge state rules, and people seen as threats to ideological control. It is also a government that has been known to pressure family members. So if a person in U.S. custody believes their case details were shared with Iranian officials, their fear does not stop at deportation. Their fear can spread instantly to everyone they love who never even crossed a border. And this is where the moral center of the story really sits. And we can argue about policy, We can argue about immigration numbers. We can argue about borders, deportations, and enforcement. But when someone asks for asylum, the one thing they should not have to fear is that the country, hearing their plea, will help the country they fled identify them more clearly. The government's denial also matters for another reason. If DHS is correct, then the lawsuit will have to prove its claims. And if the lawsuit cannot prove them, that will matter too. But if the lawsuit is even partly right, then this is not a small compliance failure. It is a direct challenge to whether the asylum process is functioning with any real integrity at all. That is why this case could end up mattering far beyond Iranian applicants. If one nationality can be exposed this way, people will ask, who else could be next? And there's another layer here that makes the story even more unsettling. The United States and Iran do not have normal diplomatic relations. That is part of why the lawsuit sounds so shocking to many people. According to reporting on the case, the contacts allegedly went through intermediaries, including the Pakistani embassy, which has long handled certain diplomatic interests between the two countries. That detail matters because it suggests structure. It suggests process. It suggests this was not a random mix-up with one bad email or one mistaken fax. The picture painted by the lawsuit is a system. If that picture is true, then the real issue is not just what happened. It is who approved it, who knew about it, who objected, and who kept it going. And if you have followed immigration policy closely, you know why so many people are already suspicious. The broader climate around asylum has been hardening for years. Enforcement language got harsher, detention expanded, removal efforts intensified. The public debate became less about protection and more about exclusion. In that kind of atmosphere, the line between tough enforcement and reckless exposure can start to blur, especially when vulnerable people are treated more like administrative problems than human beings. That is why one of the most powerful parts of this story is also the simplest. These asylum seekers were not asking for luxury. They were asking for safety. That is a very low moral bar. Not special treatment, not political power, not headlines, safety. And according to the people bringing this suit, the very information they gave to seek that safety may have been turned into a tool against them. Now, let's talk about why confidentiality is the backbone of asylum law in the first place. A lot of people hear the word confidentiality and think it sounds technical, almost boring. But in asylum law, confidentiality can be the difference between life and death. If an applicant says, I converted from Islam to Christianity, or I protested against the regime, or I am gay and I will be harmed if I return, that statement is not just a personal story. In the wrong hands, it becomes evidence for persecution. It becomes a ready-made script for retaliation. That is why even the possibility of disclosure can destroy trust long before any judge rules on the facts. If people in detention begin to believe their case files are no longer protected, then every interview changes. Every answer becomes more guarded. Every lawyer has a harder job. Every future asylum seeker hears the rumor and wonders whether silence is safer than honesty. And the tragic part is that silence inside an asylum process can wreck a valid claim, so fear itself starts doing the damage. If this breakdown helps you understand the story faster than the headlines do, hit like, join the channel, and send this video to one smart friend who cares more about truth than noise. That tiny action helps serious stories stay alive long enough to matter. This is also why the allegations about in-person meetings are so disturbing. According to the reporting, some Iranian detainees were required to meet with officials tied to the Iranian interest section, and some said those officials seemed to know the details of their immigration cases. Imagine sitting across from a representative of the government you fled and realizing they may already know why you asked another country to protect you. That is not a normal bureaucratic encounter. That is psychological pressure. It tells the detainee one terrifying thing. There may be nowhere safe left in this process. And if you want to know why this case could have a lasting effect, it is because fear spreads faster than court rulings. Once word gets out that confidential details may have been shared, people in detention talk, families talk, communities talk, lawyers warn clients, advocacy groups start hearing the same story again and again. Even if the court later narrows the facts or rejects part of the lawsuit, the emotional damage may already be done. Trust, once broken, does not come back because of one press release. There is also the international message this sends. The United States has long presented itself as a place where the persecuted can ask for refuge. That self-image has always been imperfect, and history gives us plenty of reasons to question how consistently America has lived up to it. But the image still matters. It shapes how the world sees U.S. institutions. It shapes how vulnerable people decide where to flee. It shapes whether lawyers, judges, diplomats, and human rights groups can still speak of American asylum protections as real. If a case like this moves forward and reveals systematic sharing of asylum data with a hostile government, that image takes a hit that is not easy to repair. And there is something else. This case is not happening in a vacuum. It comes at a time of deep polarization, high immigration enforcement, and intense political pressure. That matters because when politics gets hot, vulnerable people often become tools in larger battles. They become examples. They become bargaining chips. They become symbols used to project strength. The deeper fear behind this lawsuit is not only that information was shared, it is that the people involved stopped being treated as people and started being treated as useful assets in a broader strategy. That would be a devastating shift, especially in the Iranian case. Reporting on the lawsuit says Iranian officials had acknowledged that hundreds of Iranians could potentially be returned under an agreement reached with the Trump administration. Separate reporting also says more than 100 people were deported to Iran during the administration, while public records suggested roughly 600 Iranians were placed in immigration detention last year. Those numbers matter because they turn this from a theory into a field of possible human consequences. Even if only a fraction of affected people had confidential information exposed, the stakes are enormous. And still, we need to stay disciplined. A serious allegation deserves serious handling, not exaggeration, not slogans, not instant certainty. That is exactly why this case is so important. Courts exist in moments like this to force records into the light, test claims, hear denials, and separate what can be proven from what cannot. But remember, in the asylum context, delay itself can be cruel. If a person believes their family back home could be at risk right now, the calendar does not feel neutral. Time feels like danger. That is one reason the plaintiffs are asking not just for a declaration that the conduct was unlawful, but also for immediate steps like stopping any further disclosure and appointing outside review. They appear to be saying the system cannot be trusted to quietly fix this on its own. When people ask why that kind of outside oversight matters, the answer is simple. Because when the same agencies accused of wrongdoing are the only ones reviewing what happened, confidence collapses. And maybe the most haunting part of all this is how ordinary the mechanics might sound to outsiders. Meetings, files, travel documents, custody interviews, diplomatic contacts. On paper, it can all look dry. But the dry language hides a brutal possibility. Inside those ordinary steps, maybe a chain that connects a detention cell in America to fear inside a family home in Iran. That is what makes this story so heavy. Not the paperwork itself, but what the paperwork can do to human beings. So ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. If you were fleeing a regime and the last place you trusted was the country reviewing your asylum claim, what would you do? Would you tell the whole truth? Would you hold something back? Would you refuse a meeting? Would you sign anything? Would you even apply? That is the wider danger here. A broken asylum system does not only fail people who are already inside it, it scares future applicants into silence, avoidance, or despair. That is how a legal pathway dies without formally being abolished. On paper, it still exists. In reality, people no longer believe it can protect them. And that is why I think the biggest issue in this entire story is not whether one headline sounds dramatic. It is whether a core protection of U.S. law meant anything when it was tested. Because if confidentiality rules can be bent in the name of convenience, enforcement, or diplomacy, then the system starts to change its character. It stops being a shield with cracks and starts becoming a machine that may hand vulnerable people back to danger in slower, cleaner, more bureaucratic ways. There is also profound betrayal embedded in the allegation itself. Asylum seekers are told to document their fear honestly. Their lawyers tell them details matter, dates matter, names matter. The government asks for specifics because specifics help determine credibility. But if those same specifics can travel to the government being accused of persecution, then the very act of telling the truth becomes a risk. That is almost the perfect inversion of what asylum is supposed to be. And for people who have never dealt with authoritarian power, it can be hard to grasp how dangerous information can be. In freer societies, we often treat data as abstract, a record, a file, a document. Under repressive systems, information is often power. The state uses it to locate, isolate, intimidate, and punish. It uses it to turn one frightened person into a warning for thousands of others. That is why confidentiality is not a side issue. It is the firewall between a protection process and a persecution process. Let me take this one step further. Even if no one is physically harmed tomorrow, the allegation itself reveals a dangerous model. It suggests a government can use cooperation over deportation logistics as a door through which far more sensitive information might pass. That is the kind of precedent lawyers and human rights groups worry about, because once a bad practice becomes normalized, it rarely stays limited to one case or one nationality. Systems copy what they can get away with. Now let's come back to the human core of the story, because that is where this needs to end. Somewhere behind all of this are real people sitting in detention, talking to lawyers, calling family, waiting for hearings, replaying conversations and asking the same question over and over. Did they tell Iran about me? That question alone is devastating. It can destroy sleep, It can shatter trust between clients and officials. It can make every call home feel dangerous. It can make a mother wonder whether her child's name is now in the wrong hands. It can make a brother in Iran avoid his phone. It can make families pull away from each other because contact itself feels risky. And the cruelest part is that many of those people may not know what was shared, when it was shared, or how widely it moved. That uncertainty is its own form of punishment. You should also notice how this story cuts across easy partisan talking points. Yes, the lawsuit names agencies and officials from the Trump administration. Yes, immigration politics are deeply partisan. But the real standard here should be bigger than party. No administration, Republican or Democrat, should play loosely with asylum confidentiality. No agency should treat protected information like flexible material. No government that calls itself a refuge should ever let vulnerable applicants wonder whether their plea for protection doubled as a disclosure to the regime they fled. And if this story has made you stop and think, drop a like, subscribe for more plain English deep dives, and share this video where hard stories usually get ignored. Sometimes one click is how a buried issue stops staying buried. If the allegations are disproven, then the public deserves a full accounting that shows exactly why the lawsuit was wrong. If the allegations are confirmed, then the consequences should be severe, because the harm would go to the foundation of the system itself. Either way, sunlight is not optional here. The country needs facts, records, explanations, and accountability. And I think that is why this story lingers in the mind long after you read the headline. It is not only about immigration. It is about what a state owes a person who has placed their life in its hands. Once a government asks you to tell the truth about your fear, it assumes a duty. Not a perfect duty, not an easy duty, but a real one. It cannot turn around and act as though that truth is just another transferable piece of administrative data. Maybe that is the cleanest way to say it. An asylum story is not inventory. It is not cargo. It is not a document bundle to move around because a deportation file needs processing. It is a human being telling a government, this is what could happen to me if the wrong people know who I am and why I ran. If a system cannot protect that, then it has failed in the most basic way imaginable. And that is why the title of this story hits so hard. Because even if you strip away the emotion, the core fear remains. Did the government entrusted with protecting Iranian asylum seekers help expose them to the regime they feared? That is the question now sitting before the courts. And until it is answered clearly, the shadow over this case is going to keep growing. Watch what happens next. Watch the filings. Watch whether records emerge. Watch whether the denial stays firm. Watch whether outside review is granted. Watch whether affected detainees get notice. Because cases like this often fade from the spotlight after the first burst of outrage, and that is when the most important facts start to surface. But no matter where the case goes, one truth is already obvious. Asylum is not just a legal category. It is a test of national character. It asks whether a country can be trusted to hear the most vulnerable people honestly and protect them from the very powers they fear. If that trust is broken, the loss is bigger than one lawsuit. It reaches into every future claim, every lawyer's warning, every frightened family deciding whether America is still a place to run toward. And that is the part I want to leave with you. A border can stop a person. It cannot stop fear. Fear crosses oceans through memory, through family, through threats, through government records, through one conversation in the wrong room with the wrong official. The asylum system exists because law is supposed to interrupt that fear, not deliver it back. So if this lawsuit is right, even in part, then this is not a side story, it is a warning. A warning about what happens when protection becomes performance, when bureaucracy forgets what it is handling, and when human vulnerability gets folded into state power. And if the lawsuit is wrong, then the government still owes the public a transparent answer, strong enough to restore confidence in a system many people already distrust. Because without trust, asylum becomes a word on paper. With trust, it becomes a lifeline. That is the line this case is fighting over. And maybe the most powerful thing to remember is this. For the people at the center of this story, the stakes are not rhetorical. They are not content. They are not a debate segment. They are home, family, safety, faith, identity, and survival. Which means the final question is also the simplest one. When someone comes to a country asking for shelter from a regime they fear, what kind of nation do we become if their secret is no longer safe with us?